the famous parable of the prodigal son, which we could also call the merciful father, is something which appeals even to children, and it reveals the capacity of the Lord, even on the human level, to tell a story in all its powerful details, which one perhaps would not notice first time round. There are little things added very close to life. Did you notice that the rehearsal was perfect? He had prepared his speech. But did you notice that the father did not actually let him finish it? Did you notice too that the father, when the other was still a long way off, saw him coming, implying that he was there going morning after morning to look into the distance with some hope that he might turn back to his origin? Did you notice too that the language used by the jealous elder brother is very true to life? The language, for instance, of hatred. He won't even call him properly as he should be. And the way that he approaches the father is interesting. This son of yours, and this element of comparing his life, faithful and yet with perhaps little love, to that of his brother, who we will not recognize as a brother. And then the contrast that comes, my son, that warmth in the expression already there, you are with me always. He forgives, therefore, this one as well for his bitterness. And all I have is yours. And then this culmination, which is of course the message, it was only right we should celebrate and rejoice, because your brother here, therefore he is truly his brother with all his rights, was dead. That's a powerful expression. And has come to life. He was lost. And you know the word lost comes into Latin as damnatus, damned. And the son of perdition is the son of loss, perditus, lost, again, another form of the same, at least meaning. He was lost and is found. As you know, a priest is handling, rather like a doctor or even a surgeon, cases of disease which are going to lead to death, or cases of malady. The difference between the devotional confession and that of the one that actually makes a soul come back to a state of grace. And the effect in the second case is quite dramatic at times, especially if one has had to do a surgical operation before. It might not be just starting the confession, but way back in the prehistory of getting the person to come at all to that sacrament. No sin will not be forgiven as long as there is contrition and recognition. That is the problem. A person who will not recognize cannot be forgiven because there's nothing to forgive. We're in the right. And that can be our case too. Let's not make any illusion. On the contrary, a person who's really gone a long way, this element of a great distance which we have in the parable, does perhaps render that person, if touched, more open to breaking down. And some of the great testimonies of history are those who have been brought to their knees, sometimes in quite dramatic circumstances. Around the age of 19 or 20, I remember going with two close friends to the Savannah Garden Pavilions in Cardiff to hear Nicky Cruz. He wrote The Cross and the Switchblade, and he was a leading gangster. And at the end, in that large assembly, not sure how many hundred, if thousands, were very, very moved, and some to tears. He knew how to tell a story, like the Lord himself, and also to give the message. In his case, it was all because of one man, Rev.Wilkinison, a Baptist evangelical minister who would not let go of his prey. This fish he was going to catch. Closer to our Catholic world, but very different in tactic, would be St. Therese of Lisieux. She knew that there was going to be a big fish. His head was going to roll at the guillotine. And she was not going to let her fish go. She made a kind of pact, and she was really insisting that she take on herself and that this man be in some way graced just in the nick of time. No hope. No hope. Refusal of anything to do with God. And then, just a few seconds before his head rolled, he consented to do one little thing which probably had an effect on all eternity. He accepted, as the chaplain proffered the crucifix to him, to bend his head slightly and kiss it. Now we don't know what thought came at that point. I don't know whether the chaplain had time actually to give absolution, but something happened which shouldn't have happened because of the offering of a silent cloistered nun. We stand somewhere between the two extremes. We participate in both tactics. Intercession, penance undertaken, sometimes vicarious, but also the other, which sometimes will actually depend on us. Even more so if it's a family member. The word. Only the right word, and only at the right time. The wrong time, it can have the reversal of the effect that we want and lead to more aggro. At the right time, e.g. when things are down, when people are broken, it can have the right effect. Just the other day, it was St. Patrick's Day. Because it was a feast, I had two good friends here. They were coming anyway from Mass at 7 o'clock in the morning, but after Thanksgiving in chapel, before they went to their various affairs, I thought, let's have a cup of coffee to feast St. Patrick. And at the end, one of them came out with a powerful story. I hadn't realised that he had a brother, a priest, a Capuchin, at least a Franciscan anyway, and this knew things which only a priest would know. He had by chance overheard a conversation. It was what we used to call a hard knock, a sort of gangster affair, answering a question on some strange issue of theology which he as a priest knew the profundity of and the complication of. And out of the blue, this chap with the strong Dublin accent, looking like nothing on earth, came out with a theologically 100% accurate answer. And your man, the priest, knew this person has been graced by an illumination from the Holy Spirit. That's not just explicable in terms of human ingenuity. So he approached him and he wanted to know his story. From childhood onwards, he'd been in trouble, ever thicker as time went on. Equivalent of Borstal and all the rest of it, all these institutions of correction, until eventually imprisonment. And unfortunately, he didn't behave either in prison. I think he got into big trouble there. I think he actually killed somebody. Eventually he was moved to a more severe prison. Is it Portlaoise? Not sure. There's some very severe one. Yeah. Must have been in Mountjoy or somewhere before. And there things happened. I think it was there that he'd come across somebody who had obviously a vestige of faith. He was an IRA man, whatever you want to call it. Perhaps a head man, I don't know. But he had enough Catholicism in his bones to come out with this warning that if he was feeling down, which what happens in there, don't do like the others, don't commit suicide. And he gave him reasons for it, because he had a bit of faith left. So that message registered. Eventually, Obenik came along to coax him, like he'd done with the others. He'd actually hear his voice. It wasn't a nice voice. And it was actually not just the voice, but Olnick had a method also of making it sound blissful and even sort of giving an atmosphere in the air. How great to solve all your problems. The easy ways. And yet he suddenly remembered that word from the IRA gangster. Eventually, he didn't go through with it, at least straight away, and this grace came out of the blue. He'd been brought precisely to 0 point, no more pride, and therefore he was workable upon, and the Lord stepped in and worked on his soul. He was given to understand what eternity was about, what the essence of the faith was about, in relationship with his King and Maker, who was mercy itself. And he prayed. So the will at that point was changed. Remember, that's the fundamental point. Things start to happen. If the Lord finds an open will, already terrain is prepared, whatever it may follow. And he was therefore getting better from that point onwards. The gang waited for him outside the prison when his long term was up, but he wouldn't go along with what they were wanting. He moved towards Catholic circles and got him involved with the right things. And his testimony was precious. And he was giving out little tracts, Catholic ones, on O'Connell Street, and wasn't afraid to say things. Normally in Ireland, when one meets somebody that one hasn't seen for a while, one says, "Nice day today, lovely to see you." His introduction to this gangster, which he recognised, was, "You're going to hell." And that was the beginning, in his case too, of the same thing. It led to, would you believe it, confession, and fairly quickly, because he had a priest at the end of his mobile phone, and so on. Many people have a good start. He had a bad one, influenced therefore by what he was coming from. One day in Germany, when staying in Benedictine monastery, there must have been Bavaria somewhere, I was talking to the chaplain of the nuns. In fact, I'd been sent there because they wanted me to learn a bit more German, and he was very good. He knew how to do it. "While you're here, little one, we'll only have German." So he would insist not a word of anything else, at least he obliges you, but he would also give lots of time, e.g. long walks and drives in the car, exposed to this language, very efficacious as the Germans can be. And then, over one long walk, he came out with what I didn't know. Something like this. In Austria, one day, this young lad was playing in a camp, Catholic camp, obviously in Austria, with the chaplain and the other boys that were on this Christian camp. And this young lad fell into the river. The chaplain immediately jumped in and rescued him because he couldn't swim. He got out and went about his business. The name of the young lad was Adolf. Can you guess his surname? And I remember the comment in battered German was immediate. Without that, the world history would have been ganz anders, totally different. Unfortunately, we know, I don't like to admit this, but we know the final end of Hitler, because the Russians actually were keen on getting it. And so the only way of getting it was to torture, and in a prolonged way, those who were closest to him in his last days. And it was happening, the interrogations were happening night after night, therefore they were tired as well, and they were contradicting what they were saying all the time, just to make sure that under all possible conditions of stress they were getting a coherent and agreed version from all concerned independently. And it's quite clear you know exactly what happened to Hitler, his faithful dog, and his faithful mistress, eventually his wife from the previous night, Eva. It was, in the case of Hitler, the cyanide, which he'd already tested on his faithful dog and died immediately, and cyanide bitten, and at the same time, simultaneously, a bullet in his head by himself. So it was instantaneous, the two together. In the case of his wife, the bullet was not necessary, the cyanide worked. But it didn't finish there. Of course, he'd given order that all should be burned, because he was aware of what happened to Mussolini and Chiara, his mistress. Didn't want a repetition of that. And so they had to get hold eventually of enough fuel by siphoning bands and things around, and they burned him in blankets together with his wife, and that was the end of it. And eventually they had to go further. It's a long story. But what I'm getting at is this. The Russians themselves made sure there was no minimal trace, eventually, of what had been Hitler and his wife. We could say it ended all there. And he actually wrote, before committing suicide, a letter to mankind, indicating not any regret. He'd changed history, he'd gone down in history, and until the end of human history he will be talked about. But unfortunately, in recent times, he's come back. His spirit has come back. Not through any kind of spiritism, but through exorcism. So do you know what that means? It means that along with the few others like him, and I know the exorcism in question, it's Annalisa Miguel, they're German precisely. She was being tormented through, for us, difficult permission from on high for us to understand, but for the good of humanity, things were to be known. And one of the things that was known was a certain number of spirits that were actually possessing her. And they were, some of them, human spirits. So that means that some lost souls get so involved with the one they've been working for on this side that they're close to him also on the other side. And it seems that this was the case of that same Adolf. And it's rather frightening, because it doesn't mean that God is not merciful, but that we are our own worst enemies. And God has created something similar to himself, with power over time and eternity. The will and the soul that is ruled by the will. And that as the will of God created out of nothing all that is, so too we, who are in his image, have power over things and over ourselves and over our destiny forever. So much so that God honours, respects, and almost jumps back in fear in front of what he's made. He respects the will of man. Which is the answer, by the way, to those who come to you protesting against why God should do this and so on, when actually it's nothing to do with God. It's only our own botching up of what he's put in our hands. Wars, they're man's doing, abusing the power that he has. Suicide, it's man's doing, abusing the power that he has. Anything which causes pain to someone else is man's doing, abusing the good things that he has. Don't blame the wrong person. That's a cop-out. And so, when it comes to this element of looking at the overview of time and eternity, a person who is not known at all in this world, but is heroically faithful in the obscurity of a family, of a bad family sometimes, but faithful to every grace and not blocking out a single one, is zooming to glory. Whereas those who have the attention of man on this side of eternity are often disfavoured, precisely because they're far from 0 point. One sees it in singers, artists, those involved with showbiz. One sees it in politicians. one sees it actually sometimes where one shouldn't see it. One can have a spirit of independence even in the consecrated life, the priesthood, where one can be on an ego trip, pushing the Lord Jesus out of the centre and sitting in his throne. And there are tests when see that happening. People who, against the will of God, create illicit liturgy. It's not honouring God at all, it's honouring the one who's doing it. And it can be extremely serious, even if they've got great popularity on this side of eternity. So there's complete reversal of values when it comes to our last judgment. Just finish. With regard to those who can make it unexpectedly, I remember being very moved by one case which happened in communist Russia. It was the height of persecution, and this Eastern Orthodox priest was involved with underground evangelization or the equivalent thereof, distributing illegally bits of helpful literature for those who believed. And the authorities copped on, and he was tracked down because they tolerated just about liturgy. They didn't want anything like this going on. And so eventually he was warmly invited to follow them, and he was treated with the usual gentleness until he petered out under torture. But being in the Eastern Church, he had his presbytera, his faithful and holy wife, because it's a vocation out there, it's not just any kind of marriage, it's very much a team effort. And she was going to carry on his work, and she did. And all she could do was use her office typewriter. Now out there, things tend to belong to the state, and so there was a defect on this typewriter. One letter was making a botched letter each time, so the authorities noticed it and went round all the likely offices of the area to find out which typewriter had this particular problem. And so she too was likewise invited to come and follow them, to be treated with the same gentleness. And she was not talking. And eventually they were asking her why she would not talk. She would simply answer, he, meaning the Lord, would not let her. Eventually she was being taken back to her cell after a session of interrogation, but at that point she was so weak that the one who had to take her back in some way helped her with a tiny fraction of tenderness and compassion, which made her reply, "May God reward you." And that word hit him to the effect that when it came to a few days later a consultation amongst those who were doing this operation of extraction of information taking place, they were going to apply a particularly powerful method of extracting information which usually worked, extremely painful torture, and he knew what was going to happen because it involved 4 strong men. And because of the word that had reached his heart just a few days earlier, he wouldn't go through with it. 1 against 4 torturers. The only language he knew was that of the prison. He got out his revolver and started shooting the others. He immediately shot back, and in the crossfire the lady too was hit. And as she was dying, she said, "I am dying." And he just said one word, because he too was hit: "Take me with you." So she extended her hand and she died holding his.